Today, we're going to talk about the Founders Trilogy and whether this is a book that you should be reading because it recently just finished. So I figured this is the time to do the series review, should you read for it. I read Lachlan's in June. It was my highlight of June. So I guess full disclosure at the front, I am going to just talk about the different components of this series, what may work or won't work for you. I try to make these as neutral as possible, although everything's subjective. I have a subjective experience. But if you just want to know my thoughts, I really love this series. I have gone back and forth on if I want to purchase copies for my shelves, and I think if I had an unlimited amount of shelves, I already would have in the hardbacks. I love the covers, and I had a really good time with this series. My issue most of the time with this weight of fantasy is I never know if I'm going to reread them, and that's part of what goes into me purchasing books, but it was like a 4.5, 5-star series. It stuck the landing, and it did really interesting things that I was not expecting. So I had a really fun time. This was a series that I picked up on a whim a couple years ago, and it's every single book has been a book that has made me want to read, and that is something I treasure above everything else in reading experiences, is a book that makes me want to finish my workday and sit on the couch and read my book hours into the night. Like, that's my favorite thing, and this series does that for me. So that's my personal experience with it. And then obviously I'm someone with a physics and coding background, which I think is also an important thing to mention, because we'll just start with the magic system, because that's what a lot of people talk about with this. So Foundryside is the first book in the Founders Trilogy, and this world is Venetian inspired. It's a classic society where you have the haves and have-nots, and it is run by who has access to the coolest version of this tech, this thing called scriving. And we manipulate the universe with scriving by telling objects that they are actually not in the state that they think they are in. So for example, you have a crossboat, and normally when you release a crossboat, it's released with the tension that you give it through the mechanism. But here you can write on it and say, actually, you've been falling from the sky for thousands of feet, so when it's released, it thinks it's going at terminal velocity, so that's a more powerful weapon. That's some of the ways that it's used, and the way that you have certain definitions you can write for as long as you need to in the language uses kind of sort of C++ object coding, so it's Newtonian-based magic system that uses a coding scripting language, and I love written magic systems. That's just like a thing for me. I love it in Elantris. It's my favorite part of Bone Shard Daughter. It's one of my things. I really like that way of manipulating reality. Also, an important thing to note about the magic system is it's the thing we use to try and solve our problems. So, kind of pivoting into plot and scope of the series is these are plot-driven, really action-packed books. To me, Robert Jackson Bennett is my action author. He is the author that I read for beach read experiences, or when I just need to read a book and I can't put it down. That's who he is to me. In his Divine Cities trilogy, it's one of the only times where I've been convinced that detective mystery in fantasy works for me. I'm a really hard sell on that particular trope. And he also uses a trope in this that's usually a hard sell for me, and that is a heist and con. In the first book, we have Sanchia, our plucky thief, and she needs to do this heist to save the day, stakes and stuff like that. And normally I don't love that. It's not a selling point for me for that to be the plot device. But it works really well, the way the found family elements come together for that, the way that they use the magic system to try and solve their way out of the problems that are occurring in the con, I think are really fun and creative. And that's the thing, I think he does really creative and interesting things, especially as the series progresses with this magic system. And also the magic system is a part of the intrigue or mystery, which I always love a little bit of world-building mystery. That is one of my buzzwords. I love being like, oh, there's mystery to the world? We don't understand the world? Yes, I want to learn about the world. That's like my thing. I love that. That's just who I am as a reader. And there's just enough to keep me the entire series being like, yes, tell me the history. And we kind of get this through one of our main characters who is much older than everyone else, but does not remember the past. So amnesia trope, and also someone with great knowledge, and also someone with access to powers that have been lost. So we still have this very powerful magic system, but it's not nearly as powerful as it used to be. And through this character, who is one of the best characters in the series, we get insights into that. We get to unpack that. And it's actually those mysteries that lead to some of our larger stakes in later books. I also really like for this, and this might be good or bad depending on who you are as a thematic reader or who you are in terms of when a fantasy book is like, oh look, it's a corrupt society and here are our characters fighting against the corrupt society. We've all seen that thousands and thousands of times if you've read fantasy books. That's not new. And a lot of the times, sometimes we stay focused on the society and trying to fix the society, etc. This book kind of does the more traditional route of, yeah, society is messed up, but we're going to actually focus on this really bigger antagonistic force because that's just a little more important and cooler. And honestly, I've been so burnt out on really focusing on like societal thematic dialogue lately that just to fight a big bad was amazing. And yet, it's still thematically pretty nuanced in terms of its conversations of the relationship between society and technology and community. It was really actually quite interesting throughout the whole series, which I wasn't here, I didn't need that from these books. Like I said, this is like my action movie in a book series. That's truly what it is to me. It's what I go to it for. My one complaint that might actually be great for you is I think sometimes the action scenes go on too long for my liking as someone who's not a visual reader and as someone who prefers her action scenes to have things like music or special effects, things that you get in a movie. But actually, I am always well oriented in the action scenes that occur in this series. I always know who's where, what's doing what. I don't usually get confused, which can be really easy for me as a non-visual reader during an action scene in a book. Like, getting confused is pretty much what happens all the time to me. So that's kind of like the scope of the whole thing. I also just really like the characters. I don't think they're favorite characters of all time, but they feel like a family, and I'm very invested in them. Like, one thing I remembered is when I picked up Shorefall after reading Foundryside, I was instantly back in their group dynamic. Like, it's a kind of a classic opening in the second book of, like, we're in an action scene, what are their characters? And there's banter back and forth. Like, it was kind of like, I mean, I don't like Age of Ultron by the Avengers, but, like, that first scene where everyone's just, like, bantering during that big action movie, like, that's kind of how Shorefall opens. So I kind of like that. That's something I enjoy. But if you're just like, oh, that would drive me crazy, then maybe pass. Also, if you're someone who's like, I liked but didn't love the characters or the banter, but I'm sure it'll get better as the books go on, I actually think that the quality of the character work and interactions is consistent throughout, so I think what you get in book one is what you're going to get the entire time. I mean, maybe by just the nature of spending more time with characters, you'll grow more attached, but I don't actually think Shorefall or Lachlan's would suddenly make you like Sancha more than you would in the first book. Sancha's actually, her main book is the first book. She's like our main character, but she actually was not as present in the third book, which I thought was actually really interesting. And another one of my favorite characters I've been vague about, just because, is it a spoiler to talk about him? I have mentioned him in this video, but I haven't, like, talked about him. He is something. And I think a lot of the mystery is surrounding him, and he's one of my favorite tropes. I actually am going to briefly talk about him, so I'm going to put a timestamp here where you can skip ahead. This is only going to be for like 30 seconds, but I will put a timestamp and I'll put mini spoiler on the screen. But if you like the trope of inanimate objects that are sentient, it's here. It's amazing. I mean, you get introduced to it by chapter 2, so I'm putting this away now. But that's a trope that I love so much. It's one of my favorite characters in the series. So if that's another thing you like, you should definitely check this series out. So in general, hopefully that's enough to give you a sense of if the series would be for you or not. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. I do think it's very different from his Divine Cities trilogy, if you have read that, in terms of this is more of a heisty story, more of a, oh, here's a problem, we need to think of a solution as a group sort of thing, whereas Divine Cities is more like, we are dealing with the repercussions of the past, and we don't really know what's happening, and now there's a new mystery afoot, how do we solve that? Like, it's just a different scope situation, but I do think the compulsibility of the writing, the depth of the characters is the same. And what I mean by that is these are not the deepest characters you're ever going to meet, but they're also not archetypes. It's somewhere in that middle ground of I'm given just enough to latch on and be invested in these people, but they're also not so fully three-dimensional that I carry them with me for all times, if that makes sense. But that's it for this video. If you want to leave an emoji, leave a key. I think there's a key on every cover of this book. So leave a key as your emoji if you just want to leave that. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Please do not leave any spoilers for the series down below. We try to keep these very safe places for people who are just trying to look to see, is this series for me? Otherwise, if you liked it, subscribe if you want to, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.